The rain hammered against the apartment windows as Eugene Parker stood in the doorway of his bedroom, watching his roommate Brandon Cox pack his belongings into cardboard boxes. The soft glow from the bedside lamp cast shadows across Brandon's face, highlighting the exhaustion that had become his constant companion over the past few weeks. Eugene's heart twisted as he watched Brandon fold his favorite navy sweater and place it carefully into the box labeled bedroom stuff. "You don't have to leave," Eugene said quietly, his voice barely audible over the storm outside. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with everything they hadn't said, everything that had been building for months in the space between their separate beds, in the quiet moments over morning coffee. Brandon's hands stilled on the sweater, his shoulders tensing. He didn't turn around when he spoke. His voice was rough, strained. Utulfaran, Eugene's breath caught in his throat. The admission hit him like a physical blow, confirmation of everything he'd hoped for and feared in equal measure. He took a step into the room, then stopped, uncertain. The space between them felt like an ocean. "Kutwader," Eugene whispered. Brandon finally turned, and the look in his eyes made Eugene's world tilt on its axis. There was vulnerability there, raw and unguarded, mixed with a longing that mirrored Eugene's own. Quote 5. The question hung between them like a bridge neither was ready to cross, but both desperately wanted to. Eugene felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he took another step closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in Brandon's blue eyes, close enough to smell the familiar scent of his cologne mixed with something else, something that spoke of sleepless nights and desperate hope. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. But first, let me tell you how two roommates went from sharing an apartment to sharing something much deeper, and how a simple request about sleeping better changed everything between them. 3 months earlier, Eugene had been sprawled across their second-hand couch, laptop balanced on his knees as he worked on a freelance graphic design project. The apartment was quiet except for the soft clicking of his keyboard and the distant hum of traffic from the street below. Brandon had responded to Eugene's Craigslist ad for a roommate with a message that was polite, straightforward, and refreshingly free of red flags. When they'd met for coffee, Eugene had been struck by Brandon's easy smile and the way he listened intently. Brandon worked in marketing for a mid-sized company downtown, kept regular hours, and seemed like the kind of person who would replace the toilet paper without being asked. What Eugene hadn't anticipated was how Brandon would fill the space of their shared apartment in ways that had nothing to do with rent or household responsibilities. He hadn't expected the way Brandon hummed while making breakfast, or how he left little notes on the refrigerator when he was working late, or the way he always made enough coffee for 2 in the mornings. He definitely hadn't expected to develop feelings for his straight roommate. That particular evening, Brandon had come home looking more exhausted than usual, his tie loosened and his dark hair disheveled. Eugene looked up from his laptop as Brandon dropped his messenger bag by the door and leaned against the wall, closing his eyes. Eugene asked, saving his work and closing the laptop. Brandon opened his eyes and managed a weak smile. He pushed off from the wall and headed toward the kitchen. Eugene watched as Brandon opened the refrigerator and stared into it without really seeing anything. There was something different about his posture tonight, a defeated quality that made Eugene want to offer comfort in ways that definitely fell outside the boundaries of their roommate relationship. Quote 9, Brandon said, closing the refrigerator without taking anything. Quote 10, he turned toward the hallway, then paused. Get Brandon hesitated, and Eugene could see him working through something in his mind. Quote Eugene blinked, surprised by the question. 14, Brandon rubbed off the back of his neck. Shine, the admission hung in the air between them, and Eugene felt something shift in his chest. There was an intimacy to the confession that felt different from their usual conversations. Eugene said softly. Brandon's shoulders relaxed slightly. Really? Really, human beings are social creatures. We're not meant to be isolated, even when we're sleeping. Eugene paused, then took a breath and made a decision that would change everything between them. If you want, you could leave your door open tonight. That way you'd be able to hear that someone else is here. Brandon's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment Eugene worried he'd overstepped. But then Brandon's expression softened into something that looked almost like relief. Eugene said, and meant it completely. That night, Eugene lay in his own bed listening to the soft sounds of Brandon settling into sleep down the hallway. The apartment felt different with both their doors open, more connected somehow. Eugene found himself synchronizing his breathing with the barely audible rhythm of Brandon's. And when he finally drifted off, it was with a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in months. The next morning, Brandon appeared in the kitchen looking more rested than he had in weeks. His hair was still mussed from sleep, and he was wearing the old college t-shirt he favored for pajamas. But there was a lightness in his step that hadn't been there the night before. "Good morning," as he said, moving to start the coffee maker. "How did you sleep?" "Pretty well," Eugene replied, though the truth was more complicated. He'd slept better knowing Brandon was sleeping peacefully, but he'd also spent more time than usual thinking about his roommate just down the hallway. "How about you?" Brandon's smile was genuine and bright. Quote 28. Eugene felt warmth spread through his chest. Quote 29, he said, meaning it in ways that probably weren't entirely appropriate for their living situation. The open-door arrangement became their new normal over the following weeks. Brandon seemed to sleep more soundly, and Eugene found himself looking forward to the quiet intimacy of their shared nighttime routine. They would say goodnight from their respective doorways, and Eugene would lie in the darkness, listening to the soft sounds of Brandon moving around his room. It was during one of these nights, about 2 weeks into their new arrangement, that Brandon's routine changed in a way that made Eugene's heart race. Eugene was reading in bed when he heard Brandon's footsteps in the hallway. Usually, Brandon would go straight to his room after brushing his teeth, but tonight the footsteps paused outside Eugene's doorway. "Eugene?" Brandon's voice was soft, uncertain. Eugene looked up from his book to find Brandon standing in his doorway, wearing pajama pants and a t-shirt, his hair already rumpled. Quote 31. Brandon shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Quote 32. Eugene's pulse quickened, but he kept his voice casual. "Of course, come in." Brandon entered the room and settled into the armchair near Eugene's bed, drawing his knees up and wrapping his arms around them. The position made him look younger somehow, vulnerable. Eugene asked, setting his book aside. Brandon rested his chin on his knees. Quote 36. Eugene felt his chest tighten with something that might have been hope. Quote 37. Brandon was quiet for a long moment. Quote 38. Eugene's stomach dropped, but he forced himself to listen without reaction. "But something was missing," Brandon continued. "I kept waiting to feel that spark, that sense of rightness that everyone talks about when they describe being in love." "Did they?" Eugene asked quietly. Brandon shook his head. "If anything, it got worse. The longer we were together, the more I felt like I was playing a part in someone else's life. Like I was pretending to be someone I wasn't." Eugene's heart ached for the confusion in Brandon's voice. "What happened?" "I ended it about a month before I moved in here. She was talking about moving in together, and I realized I couldn't keep pretending." Brandon looked up at Eugene, and there was something raw and searching in his expression. "Have you ever felt like that? Like you were living someone else's life?" The question hit Eugene like a physical blow. He thought about all the times he tried to convince himself that his feelings for Brandon were just friendship. Quote 46, he said softly. Quote 47. Something shifted in Brandon's expression. "Really?" Eugene met Brandon's gaze steadily. Quote 51. Brandon nodded slowly. Quote 51. The question hung in the air between them, loaded with possibility and danger. Eugene felt his heart hammering as he considered how to answer. Looking at Brandon sitting in his bedroom in the soft lamplight, vulnerable and searching and beautiful, Eugene found himself wanting to be brave. Quote 52, he said quietly. Quote 53. Brandon's eyes widened slightly. "What would you lose?" "Maybe nothing," Eugene said, "or maybe everything that matters most to me." The silence that followed was charged with tension. Brandon unfolded himself from the chair and stood up, but instead of leaving, he moved closer to Eugene's bed. Eugene nodded, not trusting his voice. "Yep, yeah." Eugene felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff. Quote 15, so Brandon's breath caught audibly. "Eugene." The way Brandon said his name made Eugene's chest tighten with hope and terror. Quote 61, Shaw, Eugene said quickly. Quote 60, well. Brandon stared at him for a long moment, his expression his expression cycling through surprise, confusion, and something that looked almost like relief. Quote-man. Quote-man. The word came out as barely more than a whisper. Brandon sat down on the edge of Eugene's bed, close enough that Eugene could smell his shampoo. How long? Since about 2 weeks after you moved in, Eugene admitted. I tried to convince myself it was just attraction, that it would fade if I ignored it. But it didn't. It just got stronger. Brandon was quiet for a long moment. When he looked up again, his expression was soft and uncertain. I don't know what this means, he said quietly. I've never felt this way about another man before. Eugene's heart stopped, then started again at a double speed. Quote 70, quote 71. Brandon said immediately, quote 72. He paused. Quote is 73. The admission hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Eugene felt tear prick at the corners of his eyes. Quote 74, quote 70, Brandon said quickly. Quote 76. Eugene reached out tentatively, covering Brandon's hand with his own. The contact sent electricity shooting up his arm. It doesn't have to be confusing, Eugene said softly. It can just be what it is. Brandon's fingers turned under Eugene's, their palms pressing together. What is it, though? What are we doing? I don't know, Eugene admitted, but I know it feels right in a way that nothing else ever has. Brandon shifted closer on the bed. I've been thinking about kissing you, Brandon said quietly. Is that crazy? Eugene's heart felt like it might burst. Quote 84, he whispered. Quote, Brandon moved closer, close enough that Eugene could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. Quote, Brandon said. Quote, Santa, quote, on, Eugene said. Quote, and Brandon's free hand came up to cup Eugene's face, his thumb brushing across Eugene's cheekbone. Can I kiss you? He asked, his voice barely audible. Eugene nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Brandon leaned forward slowly, and when their lips finally met, it was soft and tentative at first, a question rather than a statement. But then Brandon made a small sound in the back of his throat, and the kiss deepened, became more certain. Eugene's hands found their way to Brandon's shoulders, and Brandon responded by threading his fingers through Eugene's hair. The kiss tasted like toothpaste and possibility, like coming home after a long journey. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Brandon rested his forehead against Eugene's. Wow, he whispered. Yeah, Eugene agreed. Wow. They stayed like that for a long moment, breathing each other's air. Finally, Brandon pulled back enough to meet Eugene's eyes. What happens now? Eugene smiled, feeling lighter than he had in months. Now we figure it out together. Brandon's answering smile was radiant. Go time 'em. They talked until nearly 3 a.m, curled together on Eugene's bed, exploring this new territory between them. Brandon told Eugene about the dreams he'd been having, dreams where Eugene was more than just his roommate. Eugene confessed to the way he'd been cataloging every smile, every casual touch, every moment of connection. I thought I was going crazy, Brandon admitted, his head resting on Eugene's shoulder. So I should quote down, Eugene suggested gently. Brandon was quiet for a moment. He said finally. Eugene asked. Brandon tilted his head up to look at Eugene. Quote 103. He said simply, quote 14. The declaration sent warmth flooding through Eugene's entire body. You have me, he whispered back. You've had me for months. When Brandon finally returned to his own room that night, they left both doors open as always. But now the gesture carried new meaning. It wasn't just about sleeping better anymore. It was about staying connected, about maintaining the intimacy they discovered. The next few weeks passed in a haze of discovery and gentle exploration. They moved carefully around each other, testing the boundaries of their new relationship. Brandon was endearingly nervous at first, seeking reassurance that Eugene wasn't going to change his mind. Brandon confessed one evening as they sat together on the couch. 200 on Discord button. Eugene assured him, taking Brandon's hand. We make this up as we go along. Brandon squeezed his hand gratefully. What if I'm terrible at it? Eugene turned to face Brandon fully, cupping his face. You're already what I need, he said firmly. You're kind and thoughtful, and you make me laugh. That's not going to change just because we're kissing now. Brandon's expression softened with relief. Quote 114, he said quietly. Quote 115. Eugene agreed, leaning in to demonstrate. Their physical relationship developed slowly, built on trust and genuine affection. The sleeping arrangement evolved naturally. One night, about 3 weeks after their first kiss, Brandon appeared in Eugene's doorway looking particularly exhausted. "Rough day?" Eugene asked, setting aside his book. Brandon nodded, slumping against the doorframe. "Client meeting from hell. I think I need to sleep for about 14 hours." Eugene studied Brandon's face, noting the tension around his eyes. "Quote 118, he said, scooting over to make room on the bed. Brandon's eyes widened slightly. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure," Eugene said firmly. "You said you sleep better when someone's nearby." "Well, I'm nearby." Brandon crossed the room slowly, then climbed in beside Eugene. They arranged themselves carefully, Brandon curling up against Eugene's side, his head resting on Eugene's chest. "Is this okay?" Brandon asked quietly. Eugene wrapped his arms around Brandon, marveling at how perfectly they fit together. "This is perfect," he murmured into Brandon's hair. Brandon relaxed completely, his breathing evening out. "Duane," he whispered. "Quote 25, quote 27." Eugene pressed a kiss to the top of Brandon's head. "There's nowhere else I'd rather be." They fell asleep like that, tangled together, and when Eugene woke the next morning to find Brandon still curled against him, he felt a sense of rightness that confirmed everything he'd hoped for. The shift in their living arrangement happened gradually. Brandon started spending more nights in Eugene's bed, claiming that he slept better there. Their morning routines adjusted to include shared coffee in bed, quiet conversations, and lazy kisses that sometimes made them both late for work. "I should probably move some of my stuff in here," Brandon said one morning, gesturing at the pile of clothes on Eugene's dresser. Eugene's heart skipped a beat. "If you want to," Eugene said, trying to keep his voice casual. "There's plenty of room." Brandon smiled. "I want to," he said simply. They spent that weekend rearranging the bedroom to accommodate both of their belongings, and Eugene found himself marveling at how domestic it all felt, how right it seemed to have Brandon's books mixed in with his own. Their relationship continued to deepen over the following months. Brandon grew more confident in expressing his feelings, more comfortable with the physical aspects of their relationship, more certain that what they had together was real and lasting. The first time Brandon said he loved Eugene, they were making dinner together, moving around each other in the kitchen with easy familiarity. Eugene was chopping vegetables while Brandon stirred sauce on the stove. Quote 132. Brandon said suddenly, his voice soft with wonder. Eugene looked up from the cutting board. Quote 133. Brandon laughed, shaking his head. Quote 134. The words hit Eugene like a physical blow, knocking the breath from his lungs. He set down the knife and turned to face Brandon fully, seeing his own feelings reflected in Brandon's eyes. "I love you too," Eugene said, his voice rough with emotion. "I've loved you for so long, can't remember what it felt like not to love you." Brandon abandoned the sauce and crossed to Eugene, cupping his face in both hands. "Really? Really," Eugene confirmed. "You're everything I never knew I was looking for." The kiss that followed was different from all the others, deeper and more desperate, full of the relief that comes from finally being able to say the words that had been building between them. When they broke apart, Brandon rested his forehead against Eugene's. "Quote 140, he whispered. Quote for one, quote what done, Eugene said firmly. Quote 43. Brandon's smile was radiant. "I found you." "We found each other," Eugene corrected gently. As their relationship solidified, they began to navigate the practical aspects of being together. Brandon came out to his family gradually, starting with his younger brother, who responded with enthusiasm. "He said he was just waiting for me to figure it out," Brandon told Eugene after the phone call. "Apparently I wasn't as subtle as I thought I was." Eugene's own coming out process was easier, as his family had known he was gay since college. The bigger challenge was introducing Brandon to his parents. Eugene assured Brandon as they drove to his parents' house. How could they not? Brandon squeezed Eugene's hand nervously. Quote 150. Eugene pulled into his parents' driveway and turned to face Brandon. "Then I'll explain to them that you're the most serious thing that's ever happened to me," he said simply, "and that I intend to keep you for a very long time." Brandon's anxiety melted into a soft smile. Quote 23, quote 105, Eugene confirmed. Quote 1V, Brandon said without hesitation. The dinner went better than either of them had dared to hope. Eugene's parents welcomed Brandon warmly, and by the end of the evening, his mother was showing Brandon embarrassing baby photos. I like him, Eugene's father said quietly as they helped clear dishes. 257. Quote one mom. Eugene agreed, watching Brandon laugh at something his mother had said. Quote 15922. The months that followed were filled with the quiet joy of building a life together. Brandon's confidence continued to grow, both in their relationship and in his own identity. I've been thinking, Brandon said one evening as they lay in bed together. About labels, I mean. Eugene set his book aside. What about them? I don't think I'm straight, Brandon said thoughtfully. Obviously, but I don't think I'm gay either. I think I might be something in between. Eugene nodded encouragingly. That makes sense. You get to choose what feels right for you. Brandon was quiet for a moment. I think I might be bisexual, he said finally. I was attracted to women before. That part wasn't fake. But this thing with you, it's different. It's deeper. Eugene felt his chest tighten with love and pride. How does it feel to say that? Scary, Brandon admitted, but also right, like I'm finally being honest about who I am. Eugene leaned down to kiss him softly. I'm proud of you, he said, for being brave enough to figure yourself out. I want you, Brandon said immediately. That's the only thing I'm completely certain about. You have me, Eugene assured him, for as long as you want me. Forever then, Brandon said with a smile that made Eugene's heart race. As they approached the one-year anniversary of Brandon moving in, their relationship had evolved into something deep and stable and beautiful. They had weathered the initial uncertainty, the learning curve of being together, the challenges of coming out and building a life as a couple. It was a conversation with Brandon's coworker that brought everything full circle and reminded Eugene of how far they had come. Brandon came home from work one evening looking thoughtful, and Eugene could tell something was on his mind as they prepared dinner together. Everything okay? Eugene asked. Yeah, just thinking about something that happened at work today, Brandon said. One of my coworkers was talking about his relationship troubles. He's been with his girlfriend for 2 years, and he says he loves her, but something feels missing. Eugene looked up, sensing where this was going. What kind of missing? That's what I asked him, Brandon said, and he described exactly what I used to feel with Sarah. Like he was going through the motions, like he was playing a part in someone else's life. Eugene set down the seasoning and turned to give Brandon his full attention. What did you tell him? Brandon smiled. I told him that sometimes the problem isn't the relationship. It's that you're looking for the right feelings in the wrong place. That sometimes what you think you want isn't actually what you need. And? And he asked me how I knew that, Brandon continued. So I told him about us, about how I spent months feeling like something was missing from my life, not realizing that what I was missing was right here in my own apartment. Eugene felt warmth spread through his chest. How did he react? He was surprised at first, Brandon admitted, but then he said it made sense. He said he'd never seen me as happy as I've been over the past few months. Eugene moved closer, wrapping his arms around Brandon's waist. What time, he said softly. Quote 93. Brandon leaned into the embrace. Quote Eugene asked. Brandon pulled back to meet his eyes. Quote he said. Quote -7. Eugene cupped Brandon's face, marveling at the certainty in his voice. I feel the same way, he said. Like everything before you was just practice for this. They kissed then, soft and sweet and full of the love they had built together. When they broke apart, Brandon smiled against Eugene's lips. Brandon said. Eugene smiled, remembering his own journey to this moment. Don't be caught, Brandon said, kissing him again. Later that evening, as they settled into bed together, Eugene reflected on how much had changed since that first night when Brandon had asked about sleeping better with someone nearby. Eugene asked, curled against Brandon's side. When you told me you slept better knowing someone was nearby? Brandon's arm tightened around him. Quote 206, he said softly. Quote 207, quote Tietonis, Eugene assured him. Quote 200, quote Tobin, Brandon said simply. Quote 211. Eugene tilted his head up to look at Brandon. Quote 212. Brandon's smile was soft and certain. Now I know that I sleep better not just because someone's nearby, But because you're nearby, because I'm exactly where I belong. Eugene felt his chest tight with love and gratitude. We both are, he agreed. As they drifted off to sleep that night, Eugene thought about the conversation Brandon had shared, about the advice to pursue what actually makes you happy, even if it's not what you expected. He thought about all the ways their relationship had surprised them both, all the preconceptions they had had to let go of to make room for what they had found together. But mostly he thought about how grateful he was that Brandon had been brave enough to ask for what he needed that first night, and how that simple request had opened the door to everything they had built together since. The next few months continued to deepen their relationship in ways that felt both surprising and inevitable. They had settled into a rhythm that felt natural and sustainable, built on genuine friendship, mutual respect, and a love that had grown stronger with time. It was during one of their quiet Sunday mornings, sharing coffee and the newspaper in bed, that Brandon brought up a conversation that would mark another significant milestone. Brandon said, setting down his coffee mug and turning to face Eugene. Eugene looked up from the article he'd been reading, noting the serious expression on Brandon's face. Brandon said, Vote 208. Eugene felt his heart rate pick up, not with anxiety, but with anticipation. Vote 210. Brandon took a breath. Quote, Twan. Eugene set aside the newspaper and gave Brandon his complete attention. Quote, Anon, he said softly. Quote, Twan, so. Brandon's voice carried relief and wonder. Really, Eugene confirmed. From the very beginning, this felt like something that was going to change my life permanently. Brandon's smile was radiant. He paused, then continued more quietly. Quote, Eugene felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. Quote, quote, Brandon admitted. Quote, Eugene reached for Brandon's hands, intertwining their fingers. I want that too, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I want all of that with you. They spent the rest of the morning talking about their dreams and plans, about the practical aspects of building a life together and the emotional reality of committing to each other completely. It wasn't a proposal in any traditional sense, but it felt like a promise, a declaration of intent that carried the weight of forever. As they talked, Eugene found himself marveling at how far Brandon had come in his journey of self-discovery. The uncertain, confused man who had asked about sleeping better with someone nearby had evolved into someone confident in his own identity and certain about what he wanted from life. Quote 232, Brandon said as their conversation began to wind down. Quote 233, Eugene replied. Quote 230, Brandon said quietly. Quote 235, Eugene's breath caught. Really? Brandon nodded. I told myself it was about sleeping better, about not feeling alone. And that was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that I felt safe with you in a way I'd never felt safe with anyone else. Eugene squeezed Brandon's hands. Quote 238 then. Quote John, Brandon said. Quote 240. Eugene leaned forward to kiss Brandon softly. Quote 241, he said. Quote 212, Brandon agreed. Quote 224, Eugene said firmly. Quote 224, Brandon considered this, then nodded slowly. Quote 246. They spent the rest of the day in comfortable domesticity, and as evening approached, Eugene found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. That night, as they settled into bed together, Eugene found himself thinking about the conversation and what it represented. It felt like a closing of a circle, a final confirmation that what he and Brandon had built together was real and lasting. Eugene said quietly into the darkness, Quote 248, Quote Tarsum. Brandon was quiet for a moment. Quote Chum, he said finally. Quote Dawn, Eugene smiled in the darkness. Quote Tom, quote Trivia, Brandon said with certainty. Quote Charmentum, Eugene settled more deeply into Brandon's embrace, marveling at the certainty in his voice. A year ago, Brandon had been confused and uncertain, struggling to understand his own feelings. Now he spoke about their relationship with the confidence of someone who had found exactly where he belonged. I love you, Eugene whispered into the quiet of their shared bedroom. I love you too, Brandon replied, his voice soft with sleep and contentment. Sweet dreams. As Eugene drifted off to sleep in Brandon's arms, he thought about all the ways their love had surprised them both, all the preconceptions they had had to let go of to make room for what they had found together. He thought about the courage it had taken for both of them to be honest about what they wanted, even when they didn't fully understand it themselves. But mostly he thought about how grateful he was that Brandon had been brave enough to ask for what he needed that first night, and how that simple request had opened the door to everything they had built together since. The months that followed brought a deepening sense of partnership and shared purpose. They had moved beyond the initial excitement of new love into something more sustainable and profound. They talked about moving to a larger apartment, travel plans, career goals. "I never thought I'd be the kind of person who planned more than a few months ahead," Brandon confessed one evening as they walked through their neighborhood. "But with you, I find myself thinking about years from now, decades from now." Eugene squeezed his hand. "What do you see when you think about decades from now?" Brandon was quiet for a moment. "I see us still walking like this, still talking about everything and nothing. I see us supporting each other through whatever life throws at us. I see us growing old together, still choosing each other every day." Eugene felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. "That sounds perfect," he said softly. "It does, doesn't it?" Brandon agreed, stopping to face Eugene under a streetlight. "I never understood what people meant when they talked about finding their person. But now I do. You're my person, Eugene." "You're mine too," Eugene replied, reaching up to cup Brandon's face. Quote to how they kissed under the streetlight, soft and sweet and full of promise, and Eugene felt the certainty of their future settle into his bones. This was real. This was lasting. This was the love story he had always hoped for. As they continued their walk home, Eugene reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had started with such a simple request, such an honest admission of need. Neither of them could have anticipated where that request would lead. Quote 267, Brandon asked, noticing Eugene's contemplative mood. "Just how much I love our story," Eugene said with a smile. "How it started with something so simple and became something so beautiful." Brandon's answering smile was radiant. Quote 270, he said. Quote 2, quote, Eugene agreed, squeezing Brandon's hand as they turned onto their street, heading home to the apartment where their love had first taken root and continued to grow stronger every day. 2 years later, Eugene stood in that same doorway, but now the context was entirely different. The boxes scattered around the bedroom weren't signs of someone leaving, but of someone staying permanently. Brandon had just finished packing up his old office supplies as they prepared to move to a larger apartment across town. Brandon said, taping up the last box with a satisfied smile. Quote 274. Eugene leaned against the doorframe, watching Brandon work with the same sense of wonder he'd felt that very first night. "Are you nervous?" he asked. Brandon straightened up and considered the question seriously. "No," he said finally, his voice full of certainty. "I'm excited. This feels like the next natural step." Eugene crossed the room to wrap his arms around Brandon's waist. "Quote striptome," he said softly. Quote 279. Brandon laughed, leaning back into Eugene's embrace. "I was a mess," he agreed. "I had no idea what I wanted or who I was supposed to be. And now? Now I know exactly who I am and what I want," Brandon said without hesitation. "I want this life with you. I want to keep building something beautiful together." Eugene felt his heart swell with overwhelming love. "Only 50 years?" he teased. Brandon turned in his arms, his expression soft and serious. "Forever then," he said simply. "However long forever turns out to be." They kissed in the middle of their bedroom, surrounded by boxes and the remnants of their old life, preparing to step into something new together. When they broke apart, Brandon rested his forehead against Eugene's. Brandon said quietly. Eugene cupped Brandon's face in his hands. "I would never have said no," he said firmly. "Even then, before I understood what it meant, I wanted to give you whatever you needed." "Why?" Brandon asked, though Eugene suspected he already knew the answer. "Because I was already falling in love with you," Eugene admitted. "I just didn't know it yet." Brandon's smile was radiant. Quote 296, he said. Quote 297. They finished packing in comfortable silence, and as Eugene folded the last of their belongings into boxes, he reflected on how much their definition of home had expanded. Home wasn't just the apartment they were leaving or the new one they were moving to. Home was the life they had built together, the love they had discovered and nurtured. "Ready?" Brandon asked, picking up the last box. Eugene took one final look around their bedroom, remembering all the conversations and quiet moments it had witnessed. Then he followed Brandon toward their new beginning. Ready, he confirmed, and meant it completely. As they walked out of their old apartment for the last time, Eugene thought about the simple truth that had started it all. Sometimes the most profound changes begin with the smallest, most honest requests. Brandon had asked for something as basic as sleeping better with someone nearby, and that simple need had opened the door to a love deeper than either had ever imagined possible. The moving truck was waiting outside, and their new life was just a few miles away. Eugene wasn't thinking about logistics. He was thinking about the man beside him, the love they had built together, and all the nights they still had ahead of them. Quote 300, Brandon said quietly as they loaded the last box. Quote 301, Eugene replied, reaching for Brandon's hand. Always. And as they drove toward their new home together, Eugene knew with absolute certainty that this was just the beginning of their story, not the end. They had found their way to each other through honesty and courage and the simple willingness to ask for what they needed. The new apartment was everything they had dreamed of. Large windows filled the space with natural light, and there was enough room for both of their work areas, a proper dining room, and a bedroom that felt like a sanctuary designed specifically for them. I love the way the morning light comes through these windows, Brandon said a few weeks after they had settled in, standing in their bedroom with a cup of coffee. Eugene looked up from where he was getting dressed, following Brandon's gaze to the golden light. Quote 304, he agreed. Quote 300, quote 300. Brandon said, turning to face Eugene with that soft smile that still made Eugene's heart skip. Everything about this life we've built together. Eugene crossed the room to kiss Brandon softly, tasting coffee and contentment. I agree, he said, though I have to say I'm particularly fond of our sleeping arrangements. Brandon laughed, the sound bright and joyful. Still sleeping better with someone nearby? The best, Eugene confirmed, remembering that first tentative question. Though I think the someone nearby is more important than I originally realized. Just someone? Brandon teased. Not just someone, Eugene corrected, his voice growing serious. You, it was always you, even before either of us understood what that meant. Brandon's expression softened with wonder and love. Quote 316, Brandon said quietly. Quote Trizen, quote Eugene replied. They stood together in their bedroom, surrounded by the life they had built, the love they had discovered. Outside, the city was waking up, beginning another day full of possibilities. Brandon asked, his voice thoughtful and dreamy. Eugene considered the question, imagining them older, more settled, their love deepened by time and experience. He said finally, quote 321, quote 322. Brandon said with a smile that made Eugene's heart race. It does, Eugene agreed, leaning in for another kiss. As they prepared to start their day, Eugene reflected on the journey that had brought them here. It had started with a simple request about sleeping better, but it had become so much more. They had found love, but they had also found themselves. Together, they had built something greater than the sum of its parts. See you tonight? Brandon asked as they gathered their things for work. Always, Eugene replied, the word carrying the promise of not just that evening, but all the evenings to come. Brandon kissed him goodbye, soft and sweet and full of love. I love you, he said, as he had said every morning for years now. I love you too, Eugene replied, watching Brandon head toward the door, already looking forward to his return. As Eugene finished getting ready, he thought about how much courage it had taken for both of them to reach for something that felt real, even when they didn't fully understand it. But mostly he thought about how grateful he was that they had both been brave enough to be honest about what they needed. The apartment felt quiet after Brandon left, but it was a comfortable quiet, full of the promise of his return and the life they would continue building together. Eugene finished his coffee, gathered his work materials, and prepared to start another day in the life they had created together. As he locked the door behind him, Eugene carried with him the same sense of rightness that had filled him that very first night. Some things were worth waiting for. Some love stories began with the smallest, most honest moments and grew into something beautiful and lasting and true. And some roommates were meant to become so much more than either of them had ever dared to hope. That evening, As they settled into their familiar routine, Eugene found himself thinking about all the ways their love had surprised and delighted them over the years. They had grown from uncertain roommates to confident partners, from tentative exploration to deep, abiding commitment. Brandon asked, noticing Eugene's expression as they cleaned up after dinner. "Just thinking about how far we've come," Eugene said. "How much we've both changed since that first night you asked about sleeping better." Brandon leaned against the counter, his expression thoughtful. "I was so scared that night," he admitted. "Not just about asking you, but about what it might mean that I wanted to ask you." Eugene turned to face him fully. "And now? Now I understand that it was never really about sleeping better," Brandon said softly. "It was about wanting to be close to you, wanting to feel connected to you in a way that I didn't have words for yet." Eugene crossed the kitchen to wrap his arms around Brandon. "I'm glad you asked," he said simply. "I'm glad you were brave enough to reach for what you needed." "I'm glad you said yes," Brandon replied, leaning into the embrace. "I'm glad you saw something worth nurturing." They held each other in their kitchen, surrounded by the ordinary magic of their shared life, and Eugene felt the same overwhelming gratitude that had filled him so many times over the years. "Ready for bed?" Brandon asked eventually. And Eugene heard in the question all the layers of meaning it had acquired. It wasn't just about sleep anymore. It was about the intimacy of shared space, shared time, shared dreams and hopes for the future. Eugene replied, understanding that his answer carried the same weight, the same promise of presence and partnership and love. As they made their way to their bedroom, Eugene thought about all the nights they had ahead of them, all the conversations and quiet moments still to come. He thought about the simple request that had started it all, and how something as basic as wanting to sleep better with someone nearby had opened the door to a love deeper than either had ever imagined possible. They settled into bed together, Brandon curling against Eugene's side in the position that had become second nature. The apartment was quiet around them, but it was the comfortable quiet of home, of safety, of two people who had found exactly where they belonged. "Sweet dreams," Brandon whispered into the darkness. "Sweet dreams," Eugene replied, pressing a kiss to the top of Brandon's head and settling into the familiar warmth of their shared sleep. As Eugene drifted off, he thought about the man in his arms, the love they had discovered and nurtured, the life they had built together one honest moment at a time. He thought about the courage it had taken for both of them to reach for something real, even when they didn't fully understand what it was or where it might lead. But mostly he thought about how grateful he was that Brandon had been brave enough to ask for what he needed that first night, and how that simple request had opened the door to everything they had built together since. Some love stories began with grand gestures or dramatic moments, but the best ones often started with something much simpler: the willingness to be honest about what you needed and the generosity to give someone exactly that. In his arms, Brandon sighed softly in his sleep, and Eugene smiled into the darkness, secure in the knowledge that they were exactly where they were meant to be. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, new moments to choose each other, new ways to deepen the love they had discovered together. But tonight they were home, they were together, and they were exactly where they belonged. And that was everything he had ever wanted and more than he had ever dared to hope for. As the months turned into years, their love story continued to evolve and deepen. But the foundation remained the same: honesty, courage, and the willingness to reach for what felt real even when it scared them. They weathered challenges and celebrated triumphs together, always returning to the simple truth that had started it all. They were better together than they were apart, and they both slept better, lived better, loved better with someone nearby. And that someone, they both knew with absolute certainty, would always be each other. Their story had begun with a simple request about sleeping better, but it had become something neither of them could have anticipated. A love that transformed them both, a partnership that sustained them through everything life brought their way, and a home that existed not in any physical space, but in the connection they had built together, one honest moment at a time. Sometimes the most profound changes in our lives do indeed begin with the smallest gestures, the most ordinary requests. Sometimes what we think we need is just the beginning of discovering what we actually want. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, and very brave, we find that the person we've been looking for has been right there all along, waiting for us to be honest enough to ask for what we need and generous enough to give it freely. Eugene and Brandon had found all of that and more in each other, and as they continued to build their life together, they carried with them the knowledge that love, real love, often begins not with grand declarations, but with simple truths. I sleep better when someone's nearby. I want to stop pretending. I love you. I want to build a life with you. And sometimes, if you're very fortunate indeed, the person you say those words to looks back at you with eyes full of the same wonder and love and certainty and says the words that change everything. I want that too. With you, always. In the end, that was all any love story really needed. Two people brave enough to be honest about what they wanted, generous enough to give each other what they needed, and committed enough to keep choosing each other, one day at a time, for as long as forever turned out to be. And they lived, loved, and slept better together, exactly as they were always meant to do.